Welcome to Rauta's Crash Course to Norwegian Black Metal around 90s, episode 9. Yes, quite a few bands have been put already back in the log. That is 3 bands per each episode, so all the big ones are now more or less gone through, and also some dead ones, not active ones and all that stuff. But the list is far from being over. We were maybe halfway through, and on this episode 9 I will actually talk about some bands that are active but not among the bigger ones. In fact, these are curious bands because while these bands have been around for more than 30 years, none of them gathered too much following, especially on social media, whereas some newer bands just went besides, and of course a lot of those older bands have bigger following. That doesn't mean, however, that these bands are without merits or without that following. I mean, whether you are looking for less FM statistics and all that stuff, you will find out that these bands have a quite big of a following. But when it comes to social media, for example, Facebook, Instagram, what have you, these bands pale in comparison with the bigger ones. One can only guess what's the reason, but of course we don't really care about numbers. But there is a reason why I decided to box these with as mid-size runner-ups. That is compared to bands like Burzum, Docthrone, Mayhem, whatever you have, or Immortal, Satyricon, Dimmu Borgir. These are way smaller, but that doesn't mean that these are meaningless bands. And in fact, all of these are pretty good, but none of them are too consistent. Well, actually, maybe that's not exactly true. Let me put it this way. Maybe none of these made those bigger classics ones, but actually made quite consistent in other ways. Let's take a look and start with Old Man's Child. Now, a lot of people consider, I'm not actually know this is factually true, but this is the feeling what I've gotten over the years. A lot of people nowadays see Old Man's Child as some kind of a Dimmu Borgir side project. I mean, why not? Galder is a big part of whole Dimmu Borgir thing, and of course Dimmu Borgir is the biggest, at least in terms of numbers and all, the biggest Norwegian black metal band. So it's years away, and some people might be just thinking that this band is a goner, dead, whatever you want to call it. But we're not going to focus on the activity level on this band, but more about why it is worth mentioning, why it's important, why it's worth listening to. That being said, already those bigger bands already make it so-called major careers or realized that they want to, some kind of reinvent themselves and go for different territories. Whether we're talking about bands like Scott or Mayhem or Burzum for that matter, lots of bands went into different directions and kind of abandoned their roots. That doesn't apply to Old Man's Child, however. In fact, I think it's one of the most consistent bands in terms and quality when it comes to Norwegian black metal. And that's, of course, a plus if you fall in love with any of the given albums. You're kind of safe to explore the other ones and say, yeah, these are all pretty good, too. Now, for me, it was Born of the Flickering that made the thing. And this actually might have been around 1996, because I remember getting it, but might really be in early 1997 too. I have vague recollections when I bought the album and was showing it to a girl I was dating and all that stuff, with the bat cover, not exactly the one that you might see here, but I'm talking about the version, let me see if I can find it, released by Century Media, by the way. This was a big thing, I guess, bigger now in hindsight than back in the days, but this bat cover was really the edition I got, and I remember liking it quite a lot. Some things were a little bit putting off for me, like not exactly the quality of what, say, Darkthrone and Burzum had going on, but there was something really, really good that applied to, like got me going. Part of the whole Old Man's Child's charm is obviously the use of melodic riffs which are catchy, and while they can be borderline cheesy, in my opinion, the balance is right there, very well done. Also, a lot of keyboards. So calling this a side, some kind of a Dimmu Borgir side project or side venture, I can totally understand it. These have a lot of overlapping, a lot of similarities, but overall the songwriting is a little bit different. One could even say that Old Man's Child is more leaning to classic heavy metal when it comes to riffs. Now, this might sound odd to younger generation who are maybe not that well versed with the whole history of heavy metal or extreme metal, black metal, whatever. But there are parts where, for example, Pagan Prosperity, the second album, or the first album, or even the third one, Ill-Natured Spiritual Innovation, they have these certain melodies which you kind of like, hey, this is some kind of Iron Maiden, on the background. Or just some other British heavy metal band. Now, Pagan Prosperity is a little bit different, obviously, from Born of the Flickering. In a way, it's more well-balanced, but I'm still on the verge figuring out which one I like most. I remember it'll be a little bit of a changer, kind of a small shock and all that stuff. And also you have to understand the lineup was more or less constantly changing with the exception of color. However, I would say, and now I'm just misclicking here, I would say Ill-Natured Spiritual Innovation is probably the best album so far. Yes, it has kind of a goofy cover, like seemingly like, some role-playing game or video game cover. I don't know, something strikes me weird. At the same time, I like it a lot. But all these albums had weird changes. For example, what was really game changer for a lot of us, Gene Hoglan being the drummer. Gene Hoglan is mostly known for his drumming for a lot of death metal band. I think Gene Hoglan, I don't know why it's typed Gene Hoglan here, is known for bands like Dark Angel, or back in the days, if you take a look at the bass list, he was big part of Death. And of course, he has played in other big bands like Devin Towns and Fear Factory and all that stuff. Really, really talented drummer, doing a lot of wonderful work. And getting that kind of a drummer to play in a black metal band felt kind of a weird and really cool also at the same time. Especially that we had as much background in the thrash metal as well as death metal, not just black metal. But let's get back to the Old Man's Child. So this lineup was constantly changing, and one can only wonder how much it had affected, or how little for that matter, whole Old Man's Child game. Because if you really think about the whole thing here, everything happened within rather short amount of time. 1996, 1998, 1997, 98. 3 albums within basically 3 years, and the quality is right there. And now a lot of people seem to dislike Ill-Natured Spiritual Invasion as opposed to, say, the debut album Born. But I would say Ill-Natured is actually more mature. Obviously, the changes are there, which might a little bit putting you off. Like if you like the first album, and the third album is like, hey, this is a little bit different. But overall, like if you zoom out a little bit, all these albums, no matter if we're talking about 2001s or the 3 first ones during the 90s, in my opinion, you can just safely call them synth-filled melodic black metal. Synth is a very important part of that because the keyboard really are playing a big game there. Maybe not as dominating as on Dimmu Borgir, but still, let's be honest about it. Old Man's Child wouldn't be the same band without the use of keyboards. So these later albums were something that I kind of jumped off the wagon before going into these ones. I don't know, I maybe just lost my interest towards overly melodic, a lot of keyboard using black metal, and I still haven't gotten it back. For me, black metal was more about rawness and sounding evil and being very dark music. When you had just too much cheese on the top of things, a lot of keyboards, clean vocals, what have you. And I'm like, okay, thanks, but no thanks. This is just something like too different. Let me put it this way. I like a spicy food. I like spicy food a lot. Be it Mexican or Indian, Korean, Thai food. When you remove the spiciness and replace it with a lot of sugary things, sweet things, it's almost like, yeah, I kind of like what you're having. You still have the rice, you still have the noodles, you have the meats. but the overall thing is not my thing anymore. And that is exactly what's happening to Old Man's Child. So don't get me wrong, I totally do not dislike the band. It's just not one of my favorite bands for the following reasons. I'm really happy to just listen to all of these albums, and they kind of give me the nostalgic vibe, like, hey, this is how it was back in the days, and the band kept going consistently. Even though the pace kind of got slower down. I mean, after 1998, 2000, then 2003, 3 years, 2 years between 2005, then 4 years, and then nothing. Now, what I was hearing, for example, when I was visiting Norway this year, in Bergen Beyond the Gates Festival, was that I was told that Old Man's Child is far from being dead. But really, as much as in sports, it goes like a little bit like in art. You're only as good as your latest album, or only as active as your latest albums. So if you have more than 10 years being in the albums in the making, it's kind of hard to, really consider you're active. But still, I mean, go for the discography. I pretty much can guarantee you that unless you're allergic to melodic black metal or a lot of keyboards being used, all these albums, all these 7 albums Old Man's Child did within less than 15 years. I mean, they are some good stuff. And while not my favorite kind of stuff, can't really bitch about any of these albums. They're consistent in style and quality and totally worth taking a look. But I gotta say, the first 3 albums are the best ones for me. But that doesn't mean the later albums are bad. By no means. Actually, they are quality-wise quite the same. I just don't have the same experience with the later albums as the first one. So I'm kind of biased like that. Let's move on to the second band on this episode, and that is Tulus, one of the most underrated band in my opinion of Norwegian black metal. Also kind of weird because they started as early as 1991, yet they are rarely mentioned among the first bands out there. But, demos from 93, 94, 95 really put them on the map quite early on. However, for some reason, later years, they have more faded on the background. And that is not because, inactivity. Yes, there was a gap between 2000 and 2006, because that's when Cold came into play. And basically, they were the same guy. Some might even say basically the same style. But there are differences. We'll talk about Cold later on. Even though technically not a 90s band, but we'll let it slide for a couple of reasons. And I'll get back to that later on. But when it comes to Tulus, Pure Black Energy, yes, with kind of a goofy cover, and this was actually explained in the interview I did with Tulus a few years ago. Just watch it if you are interested. This band already showcased a little bit different take on black metal than a lot of those bands that went when they either go really symphonic, talking about Emperor, or really fast, talking about bands like, Marduk, and bands like that. But Tulus was more about like mid-tempo stuff. In a way, there is kind of a dark Thronian vibe, but not as raw and not as dark in a way. But definitely something interesting was going on. And I remember quite liking Pure Black Energy back in the days, but it never made to my, favorite lists. I still think it's kind of a good album, but not exactly great. That was followed by Mysterion already 2 years later, and Evil 1999, kind of a goofy title if you ask me, 3 years later. And these all have kind of a horrible covers if you ask me. Like always just like a logo and some face here. I mean, don't get me wrong. I like Tulus, but these covers, these are borderline horrible. Actually, this one is horrible, not just borderline. But the music is right there. Kind of a mid-tempo, kind of a groovy, and yet the kind of a sinister atmosphere right there. And then it stopped for many years, only to come back less than 10 years later with Biography Obscene, which is not as good as the early albums, but then again, quite good still, nonetheless. And in my opinion, the band has only gotten better later on. I would actually go as far as to say that this 2023 album, which I reviewed a few months ago, Fandens Kall, is actually the best Tulus album up to date. Yeah, it sounds kind of weird to say a band that has been here for 30 years made their best album some 30 years later. I mean, more than 30 years if you count the 1991 as a starting point. And also these albums like Olm, Ogbide, or Old Death. These are very loyal, very true to Tulus style, what was already founded in 1990s. And the style is mostly mid-tempo, kind of haunting, kind of a groovy, but being very true to that. Whereas a lot of bands, not to mention bands like Dark Throne, Mayhem, Burzum, what have you, changed their styles too much. Tulus was like, we're not gonna you know, falter. We're not going to change our style. We're going to stay true. It's not for everybody. Those who want melodies, Tulus is not the band for them. Those who want a lot of keyboards, Tulus is not for them. Those who want just absolute speed, talking about like Funeral Mist and whatever, Tulus is not for them. Those who want something grim, something haunting, some kind of a wicked in a way, and don't mind a little bit of grooviness. I wouldn't call them black and roll, but you might call it and having a seasoning of it. Tulus might be your thing. I think it's underrated band by many means because this style, the lineup, whatever it has been, the whole discography is very, very stable, very consistent, and they never went weird ways, never exploring some kind of a progressive or avant-garde-ish elements like so many bands did. So whereas a lot of bands, in my opinion, kind of failed us, like almost like betrayed us, Tulus never did that. They just went on hiatus for many years, and I think that was a brave move in a way, especially in hindsight, because they could have really been tapping to that Norwegian black metal hype and all that stuff, but kept going all the way from 2000s. But instead they did Cold and then came back Tulus, and now we have both. Like, we're really winning. In my opinion, definitely a band you should be taking a look at. And of course, links are followed in the description box included. So whatever you want to listen on this episode, the links are right there. And the last, but definitely not the least, is Ancient from Norway, 1992. This was one of the early birds also in that sense that already 1993 and a demo out, 1994 another one. And then, as early as 1994, Svartalfheim, which is the home to the Dark Elves in the Asgardian god tales, the pantheon tales from Viking stories and all that stuff. Now, this doesn't still mean that Ancient was a Viking metal band, but these two album titles, or album and EP titles, Trolltar, which is, of course, talking about trolls, and Svartalfheim, they're definitely giving a kind of a vibe that now we are having this kind of a Viking metal bands. But maybe these guys were just figuring out whatever is their style. I mean, come on, they were quite young guys, late teens, early 20s, or whatever. And as such, of course, you might have some kind of a, I wouldn't call it identity crisis, but looking for kind of a way to carve your path and whatever. I don't know, Svartalfheim is, in my opinion, one of the best Ancient albums. It's kind of a mid-tempo, different than Tulus, but also kind of the same. One could even say there's a lot of Gorgoroth and Darkthrone, early ones, in the mix, but it's sounding different. And what is something of a trademark for Ancient, in my opinion, is that they use a lot of semi-acoustic, or let's call them non-distorted electric guitars. So a lot of bands went just, the kind of a basic metal ways. You have your distorted guitars doing the riffs and all. Ancient always flavored, give a little bit of a seasoning on their albums with a lot of these semi-acoustic parts. In my opinion, they're nice. I always also love when bands, say early Dissection, used acoustic guitars back in the days to just, kind of interludes to the mix. This is one of the things, in my opinion, which separates Ancient from the rest of the bands. They always kind of had their own style, and mostly did kind of a mid-tempo-ish things. Even though, for example, on Trolltar or some later albums, there are actually blast beats, but not as dominating than a lot of bands, which just went all the way down with the fast tempo. Ancient always kind of slowed down for a big part of the albums, the big part of the songs, and I think that's something that separates it from a lot of bands. Overall, however, the quality of the albums, it's not very consistent, and this is what separates this one from the other bands in this episode. Like I said, Svartalfheim is a good album. The Canian Chronicle, which is more softer, kind of tapping into some kind of a Cradle of Filth ways, being more symphonic, very much gothic, and more atmospheric black metal with synthesizers and all that stuff. I don't think it's that good. I think it's a decent album, but it's more like the band is trying to figure out what they do. And now there's a saying among the review guys that the third album is so often a harder one for a lot of bands. You won't hear that maybe on Tulus, you might not hear it on Old Man's Child because there's not so much change with the style and all that stuff, but you can really hear it on Ancient. I mean, Mad Grandiose Bloodfiends, not only it has a kind of a horrible cover, I mean, what the hell, really? It also is like a bad version of Cradle of Filth. It's, first of all, it's way too long. I mean, this is not the worst of the problems, but having almost 70 minutes of an album with this kind of a weird ways is just like, please don't. On top of that, it's like a bad Cradle of Filth copy in so many ways. Some of the moments on this album is something that I could call cringy. they're weird, like forced laughter. It's like ha ha ha, evil laughter. Come on, please. Then there are also riffs which are like, why? Whispering moments. Some kind of gothic mix-up of things. It doesn't sound really black metal if you are comparing to a lot of albums we're talking about here. And it just sounds overall kind of a bad and a drag. And some people say the lyrics are horrible. I never read it and won't be including them for this episode, but I've been told they are just horrible. Maybe for another episode we'll talk about it. But this is an album that is the exception to the whole Ancient discography, where the others are actually at least decent or just outright good. Mad Grandiose Bloodfiends is mediocrity at best, maybe even less. It's almost like a disturbing album because it's kind of off. It's something that I would delete from the old discography. So if you pay attention here for a lot of these review scores on, for example, Metal Archives, and this applies, by the way, rate your music site for the review scores. These other scores are quite good. But Mad Grandiose Bloodfiend, 34% based on 6 reviews average. Not that bad in my opinion, but clearly shows the way that I'm not the only one thinking it's actually a bad album. Now, Halls of Eternity is one of the better ones, and it's a big step just 2 years later, and it sounds like a totally different band. It's like just reinvented, resurrected the whole band, and it's actually pretty good of an atmospheric black metal. Having synths, having those trademark riffs and all that stuff. Proxima Centauri, not as good in my opinion. It's kind of a, like Canyon Chronicle, like a, I don't know, somewhere in the middle. However, Night Visit, actually, especially the drumming on top of the riffs and all that stuff, is one of the better ones. And actually, Back to the Land of the Dead is one of the better ones. So if I got to choose my favorite ones from Ancient, I would say the debut album and the last one. So in that sense, they kind of saved it. So no matter there's a weird folly one in the middle of the whole things, because the rest of the ones are just decent or good. So I would say, overall, I would say Ancient has like 3 good albums. The first one and the 2 last ones. And then there are like 3 quite okay, decent ones, and then 1 horrible one. So quite good overall. Then again, you could say the same about Tulus and Old Man's Child. For that matter, none of these bands have weak albums at all, even if not absolute classic masterpieces, something that I would consider black metal classics, like a capital C. Overall, Ancient is definitely worth listening. Maybe a little bit something putting off for people is like Afazel, the main guy, turned to Christianity. So a lot of people might not really be into that, especially if this ideological and lyrical side might be a big thing. I mean, it's kind of important to me too, but I don't care it that much anymore. Mostly it's just music for me, and it doesn't matter what the ideology or lyrics or the opinions are. I do separate the good from the great ones when it comes to these kind of details, but overall, the big picture, not so important. What is also curious to mention, and this is something that I just learned on Metal Archives, so I haven't confirmed whether it's true or not. Now, a lot of Ancient albums had female vocals, and they were always changing. Like you had Kimberly Goss doing some stuff. She also did stuff for Children of Bottom and Dimmu Borgir, whatever, Synergy. And then they had Deadly Christine, etc. And also this Erichte. So always changing. But what is interesting in Deadly Christine, this, according to Metal Archives site, converted to Islam. So one person converted to Christianity, another one to Islam, and the rest, I don't know. Ancient has been more or less kind of a mercenary band since the early days, because the only original member from the original lineup is Zell, or Afazel, from 1992. And the rest of the band, more or less, either live musicians or session musicians, or just some people who joined later on, even though this Tulus guy has been in the band already since the 90s. So it's kind of weird, especially when you compare it to the Tulus or an Old Man's Child, which are more like, Old Man's Child is Calder's project, and Tulus has been these 3 members, or of which 2 are still from the 1993. So it's kind of a different. But if we just disregard the whole lineup changes and all that stuff, yeah, go for all of these 3 bands. I think they never failed, except Ancient for that one album. Did I mention enough times? Anyway, jokes aside, give them a chance. You will find links provided in the description. They will lead to you the Metal Archives, and then you can just go with the related links. Go for your favorite streaming services. All these bands are available more or less, at least on Spotify, whatever, where I was listening to these. So go check them out. And also, Ancient and Tulus interviews are out there, which are linked to this video. So if this video got you interested to check out the bands, or if you missed those interviews and you're already a fan of the bands, go check them out, and I hope you like them. Rant over. Take care and see you soon with next episode, episode 10 of Norwegian black metal coming from the 90s. Let's see what kind of bands we have right there. Now, off you go. Bye-bye.